We're talking about anger. We're talking about conflict. We're talking about intimacy. And we're going to show you how all three of these things are not separate conversations. They are the same conversation. Let's go. All right, so here's the thing nobody tells you before you get into a serious relationship. Every single person walking into that relationship is carrying a rule book. And that rule book was written in their childhood home by watching how their parents handled conflict, how they handled emotion, how they handled each other. And most of us don't even know we have the book. We just operate by it automatically. So imagine this. One person grew up in a home where anger was silent, where if somebody was upset, they withdrew. They went cold. They wouldn't look at you, wouldn't speak to you, just shut completely down until they internally decided they were over it. That was just how things worked. That was normal. Now put that person in a relationship with someone who grew up in a completely different kind of home, where if somebody was upset, everybody knew it. There were loud arguments. Things got said at the top of their lungs. And then 10 minutes later, the storm would pass and everybody's hugging in the kitchen, telling each other how much they love one another. Now put those two people in the same relationship. To the quiet one, that screaming cycle looks like absolute chaos, like something is deeply broken. To the loud one, that cold, punitive silence feels like emotional abandonment, like being shut out by someone who's supposed to love you. It's like two people sitting down to play a board game, but one person memorized the rules for chess and the other person memorized the rules for Hungry Hungry Hippos. Nobody's cheating, nobody's being malicious, they just learned completely different games. And when those two rule books collide, you get the meatloaf incident. So here's what happened, and I'm telling you this story because it is too good not to tell. They're dating. She invites him over for a home-cooked dinner, meatloaf, mashed potatoes, the whole spread. She tells him to be there at 6 p.m. sharp. He is out playing golf with his boys, 30 miles away. 5 o'clock hits, and his friends start teasing him about being controlled by a woman. And his young, fragile ego takes the wheel. He decides, I don't need to be there at 6. He finishes the round and strolls in around 6:40, sweaty, unapologetic. He walks into a freezing cold kitchen. She won't look at him. She puts his plate of cold food in front of him and sits down across the table. And they sit there in this thick, suffocating silence. Finally, he breaks the silence, and he asks the worst possible question in the history of relationships. He looks at her and says, "What's your problem?" Y'all, she picks up her plate of meatloaf and dumps it completely over his head. And then she storms out, gets in her car, realizes his car has her blocked in the driveway, and she throws it in reverse and drives straight through the backyard fence to escape. Now, here's what I want you to see in that story, because it's not just funny, it's actually profound. A great relationship is not one without anger. That is a biological impossibility. A great relationship is one where two people have learned how to process anger safely, because anger itself is not the villain. Anger is just an alarm bell. It's a healthy, necessary emotion that tells you a boundary has been crossed. The goal is not to remove the alarm system. The goal is to manage the fire so it doesn't bring the whole house down. So let's talk about what we do wrong when anger shows up, because there are 4 traps that most of us fall into, and I want to walk through every single one. Trap number 1, denying it. When you deny anger, it doesn't disappear, it goes underground. And clinical psychology actually defines depression as anger turned inward. Think about that. If you refuse to process your frustration, your body still has to carry it. It sits inside you. It depletes your emotional energy. You wake up exhausted with nothing left to give because your subconscious is spending everything it has just trying to keep that frustration suppressed. And if that suppressed anger doesn't turn inward into depression, it turns outward into what I call the gunpowder effect. You know those people who completely lose their minds over something tiny, like socks left on the floor? They don't actually have an anger problem. They have an unforgiveness problem. Because they've been hoarding every unresolved frustration for months, maybe years, packing it down into their emotional basement like gunpowder in a musket. And then one tiny spark, one small trigger, And they're not reacting to the socks, they're detonating a decade of stored grievances all at once.
And if you're not an explosive person, that denied anger shows up as passive aggression. Deliberately eating chips in bed just to get crumbs on your partner's side, squeezing the toothpaste from the wrong end, putting the toilet paper roll on backwards, on purpose. And why do we do that? Because it gives us plausible deniability. We get to punish our partner without ever having to risk actually addressing what we're upset about. But here's the truth about passive aggression. We resort to it when we don't feel safe bringing up a direct complaint, which means if your partner is being passively aggressive, the real question isn't what's wrong with them. The real question is, what kind of environment have you built? Which brings me to trap number 2, and this one is going to step on some toes. Imagine walking into a department store with a leather jacket you bought 3 years ago. The shoulder seam has blown out. You walk up to the counter, fully expecting to pay for the repair. It's way past warranty, that's fair. But the clerk is incredibly gracious. She apologizes for the inconvenience and tells you to just go grab a brand new jacket off the rack. Free, no questions asked. You leave that store feeling valued. Now imagine a different store. You try to exchange a shirt that was gifted to you. You take it to the counter, and the clerk immediately accuses you of having worn it. The manager gets called over. He refuses to make eye contact. He holds the shirt up to the harsh light. And then, he aggressively smells the armpits of the shirt to check for sweat, slams it down, and begrudgingly tells the clerk to replace it. Now I want to ask you something, and I want you to sit with this question. What kind of customer relations counter do you run in your relationship? When your partner brings you a legitimate complaint, do you make them feel safe? Do you receive it with grace? Or do you smell the armpits of their argument? Do you interrogate their motives, question their memory, shame them for even bringing it to you? Because here's what happens when people feel like they can't safely return a defective part of the relationship to you. They stop trying. The counter closes. And when people feel stuck with defective parts, resentment moves in. And that gunpowder starts packing itself down, layer by layer, year by year. Trap number 3, going to bed angry. I know we've all heard, don't let the sun go down on your anger. But here's what's actually happening psychologically when you do. You're lying there in the dark, back to back, too proud to ask for the blanket, staring at the wall. And your brain is actively building a case against your partner. It is searching for evidence to justify the anger. You start rewinding every past argument, every disappointment, every moment they let you down. And you're viewing all of it through a filter that says, this person is against me. And by morning, you haven't just stayed mad, you've radicalized yourself in your own bed. You've convinced yourself that their mistake wasn't an accident, it was intentional. It was malicious. You have rewritten the entire history of your relationship to prove that you married a villain. That is not dramatic. That is what unresolved anger does to the human mind overnight. And trap number 4 is related. It's letting the slanderer in. See, in the ancient Greek text, the word for devil literally translates to slanderer, someone who whispers accusations, who twists the truth, who takes a small offense and inflates it into evidence of someone's fundamental character. And when we go to bed angry, when we let bitterness sit overnight, we open the door to that voice. We let it parks our marriage. We let it tell us who our partner really is. Don't do it. So what do we do instead? How do we actually handle conflict without destroying each other? Here is the most important practical rule I can give you, and research backs this up completely. A conversation almost never rises above the tone of its first 3 minutes. If you come in hot, threatening, attacking, going for the throat, you have triggered a biological survival response in your partner. Their brain has registered a threat. They are now in fight or flight. And once that happens, rational communication is over. The trajectory is set in the first 3 minutes and it almost never recovers. So you have to start softly. Even when you are furious, even when you are completely justified, you have to begin with something like, I am deeply upset right now, but I love you, and we need to figure this out together. And then, and this is critical, you need to know the difference between complaining and criticizing. Complaining is about me. It sounds like, when this happened, I felt isolated. I felt hurt. I felt like I didn't matter.
It's focused, it's about a specific event, it's about your internal experience. Criticizing is about you. It sounds like you did this because you were selfish. You never think about anyone else. There is something fundamentally broken in you. You see the difference? The moment you shift from the event to their character, you have put them on a witness stand. You have become the prosecuting attorney, and their only two options are to confess to being a terrible person or fight back. Nobody responds well to that. Nobody. But if you stay in the space of, here is what I felt, they can actually hear you without the armor going up, without the receiver jamming. Now, here's the part that requires the most from us. And honestly, it might be the hardest thing in this entire episode: radical forgiveness. There was a man who hurt someone deeply, professionally, personally, and that person developed what he described as a torture chamber in his heart, where every day he would mentally drag that man in and rehearse his anger toward him. And here's what he eventually realized. He thought he was locking that man up, but he was the one living in the dungeon. The unforgiveness wasn't punishing his offender, it was rotting his own soul, his own personality, his own capacity to love. So he forced himself to do something that went completely against every feeling he had. He prayed for that man, actively, for 10 days straight. He admitted his fingers were crossed. He didn't want to do it, but he did it anyway. And somewhere in those 10 days, he had a moment where he saw beyond the person who hurt him. He saw a child, a wounded, damaged child who had been shaped by traumas nobody around him could see. And in that moment, his hatred turned into compassion. That is what forgiveness actually is. It's not saying what they did was okay. It's choosing to see the broken child behind the hurtful adult. It's releasing the dungeon. It's putting down the gunpowder before it destroys you.
Now I want to shift gears because we need to talk about intimacy. And I'm not going to treat this like a taboo subject. I'm going to treat it like what it actually is: a mechanism that was designed for lifelong connection and pleasure. And when it's not working, it's almost never the real problem. It's a symptom of something deeper. Think of it like a car's owner's manual. The manufacturer gives you specific instructions. Change the oil every few thousand miles. Don't drive on a flat tire. Those rules aren't there to ruin your road trip. They're there to protect the machine so you can keep driving it for decades. The boundaries around intimacy work exactly the same way. Inside those boundaries, there is a massive, expansive yard to play in. But you have to understand how the machine works. And here's the biggest thing most couples get wrong. For many men, physical intimacy stimulates emotional connection. For many women, emotional connection stimulates the desire for physical intimacy. Y'all, read that again. Those two sequences are opposite, completely reversed. Which means if you don't understand your partner's sequence, you will spend years confused, frustrated, and feeling rejected, when the real problem is just that nobody explained the wiring. For many women, the brain is the primary sexual organ. If she feels emotionally disconnected, if she is mentally overwhelmed by everything on her plate, her body physically will not respond. Anxiety is an anti-aphrodisiac, full stop. For many men, the physical act itself is a neurological release valve. It may actually be the only space where he feels safe enough to drop his guard and access his deeper emotions. Which leads me to something that sounds funny, but is actually deeply practical. Guys, you want to be irresistible to your wife? You think you need to hit the gym, get a haircut, put on cologne, and strut around like you're in a music video. Pick up a vacuum. I'm serious. Surveys consistently show that women find their partners most attractive when they are doing housework, folding laundry, doing the dishes, taking a massive chunk of the mental load off her plate without being asked. Why? Because that is sacrificial character in action. That is proof that you are in the trenches with her, that you see her, that you value her. And that creates the emotional safety that makes everything else possible. Now I want to tell you one more story because it is almost unbelievable, but it's real. There was a couple, unhappily married, completely disconnected. They had essentially checked out of each other, spending every evening in separate rooms on separate computers. And they both ended up in online chat rooms and started having emotional affairs with strangers online. They fell hard. Deep conversations, real vulnerability, fantasy, everything their marriage lacked. They finally arranged to meet in person, at a hotel. They walk into the lobby and they look at each other. It was their spouse. They had been having an emotional affair with each other. They actually divorced over it, which is heartbreaking. But the irony, the tragedy of that story, they were entirely capable of giving each other everything they needed: the focused attention, the vulnerability, the emotional depth, the compliments. They just outsourced it to a fantasy version of a stranger instead of doing the hard, gritty, uncomfortable work of being that vulnerable with the real person sitting in the next room. That story is a warning. It is so much easier to build a fantasy with someone who doesn't know your history, your failures, your moods, your bad days. But real intimacy, the kind that actually sustains a life, demands that you let someone see all of it: the staged living room and the messy room you keep locked. That requires transparency. That requires no hidden conversations, no secret accounts, no digital lives your partner doesn't have access to. Because if you feel the need to hide a conversation, that is not a privacy issue. That is a threat to the safety of your relationship. And to sustain that kind of intentional, transparent intimacy, you have to be deliberate about it. Schedule it, plan it, have the conversation. What's working? What isn't? What do we both need more of? It sounds clinical, but it creates freedom. When you rely solely on spontaneous mood, you invite constant anxiety and rejection. One person always guessing, the other always feeling pressured. The guesswork exhausts you both. Intentionality removes that weight, and it says, you matter enough for me to plan for.
So here's where it all comes together. Whether you are navigating a cold plate of meatloaf or the deeply vulnerable space of physical intimacy, the core requirement is identical. Both demand an atmosphere of absolute honesty and safety. How you manage your own internal gunpowder, how you process those daily inevitable frustrations, how safe you make your partner feel when they approach your counter. That is what determines the quality of everything in your relationship. Not the grand romantic gestures, not the anniversaries, not the big moments. The hundreds of tiny, mundane interactions every single week. Because here's the truth. We spend so much energy trying to curate a perfect image for the world. A flawlessly staged open house that looks good from the outside. But true intimacy, emotional and physical, demands the exact opposite. It requires the mess. It requires letting someone walk past the staged living room and see the real thing, and trusting that they won't walk out the door when they do. That is the terrifying, beautiful, costly risk of being truly known. So I want to ask you, is your internal store open for real business? Or are you still locking the doors to protect yourself from the mess? Think about that. If this episode hit home today, and I believe it will for somebody, share it. Don't keep this to yourself. Send it to a friend, a sibling, a couple you know who's in a hard season right now. You never know what one conversation can unlock. Like this episode, leave a review if it blessed you, and drop in the comments which part of this hit you the hardest. The gunpowder? The customer service counter? The vacuum cleaner? I want to hear from you. Until next time, keep it honest, keep it grounded, keep the faith.